All right, well, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Audrey Mossberger, as some of you might know, and I'm the Director of Events at the National Bureau of Asian Research. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event, The Future of CCP Stability, Implications for Taiwan. Following remarks by our keynote speaker and our expert panel, we'll open things up to questions from the audience. For those of you joining us here on WebEx and over live stream, please email your questions to events@nbr.org. We encourage you to submit questions throughout the event, as you might find that it's addressed during the course of the discussion. If not, our moderator will do her very best to present all questions to our panelists within our allotted time today. Finally, the video recording of today's event will be available on our website at nbr.org shortly after the event. Thank you all for joining us for what is sure to be a very engaging and informative discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to NBR's Executive Vice President, Michael Wills. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon for those of you on the West Coast. Good evening for those of you joining from the East Coast. Good day for anyone in between or elsewhere. It's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. We've all been watching with great interest the sixth plenum that took place in Beijing early last month. And as expected, the sort of coronation of Xi Jinping as the third member of the pantheon in the party's leadership alongside Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. That in and of itself was not a surprise. For those of us who've been watching Chinese politics, we've long looked toward this as a step toward Xi's presumable assumption of a third term at the 20th Party Congress next year. And so on the surface, this looks like great stability. Xi has consolidated control within China. He's fully in control of the party, and he's moving the country in a direction that's very much in his image and his vision. And yet, those of us watching closely are sort of also attuned to these sources of instability within the system that underlie this apparent level of calm. Certainly speculation about rival factions within the party that might be pushing against some of what Xi Jinping is trying to achieve. The very fact that Xi has done away with the traditional two-term and then succession by committee framework that Deng put in place has opened up new areas for instability as the party looks to its future. And all of this is on top of a sort of somewhat uncertain socioeconomic situation, massive electricity shortages across China in the past month or two, still dealing with the COVID pandemic, a huge real estate crisis that called into question China's financial markets and the growth there. And so I feel like there's less certainty and less stability within the Chinese party state than appears to be there on the surface. So our discussion today will look partly at that, and also at the implication of that churn underneath the superficial stability for a critically important relationship, and that is the one across the strait and China's relations with Taiwan and attitudes towards Taiwan. So we're delighted to have you join us today. We're thrilled to be collaborating with our friends at the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office here in Seattle on this event. And I'm going to turn now to the Director General there and have him make some opening remarks. Director General Daniel Guoqing-Chen recently returned to Seattle, I guess a year or so ago. It feels recent because of the pandemic. We haven't seen each other as much as we would have liked, but it's great to have him back. He served here previously in the early 2000s at the TICO office, has also served in the TECRO office in Washington, D.C., and been a long-time member of Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs based in Taipei. And so it's a pleasure to have him back. He's a graduate of Zhengzhou University and Georgetown University. And Daniel, I'd like to turn to you now and offer you the floor to make some opening remarks.
Thank you, Michael. So good afternoon and good evening, everyone. So thank you for inviting me here. And I'm very happy to have the chance to discuss this very tiny topic, the future of the CCP, stability and the implication for Taiwan. So as you know, Taiwan is on the front line of the global competition between democracy and authoritarianism. So to ensure Taiwan is well prepared to meet all the challenges and reduce the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculation, so we have been investing a lot to get a clear picture of CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. So let's review what's going on, what's happened after Xi Jinping took power in the late 2012. So first, he quickly consolidated his political powers, and in the name of launching anti-corruption, he cracked down and purged his opposition forces in the CCP, silenced his enemies, turned China once high-flying technology and a financial conglomerate, so crushed internal dissent and forcefully assert China's influence on the international stage. The just concluded sixth plenum paved Xi's way to indefinite extension of his throne to be officially confirmed, which is going to be confirmed at the 20th Party Congress in 2022. So the outcome of a permanent Xi's leadership could very well deepen China's hawkish foreign engagement style, and which have a profound impact not just on Taiwan, but also on the rest of the world. In the name of protecting China's 核心利益 core interest, Beijing has never given its ambition to Taiwan. So since 2020, we have seen China increasingly dispatches aircraft and vessels in the Taiwan Strait, intrude into Taiwan South ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, almost every day, as well as purposely breach the middle line in the Taiwan Strait every now and then. So the importance of peace and security and stability in the Taiwan Strait has been the focal point of discussion at the US-Japan Summit, ASEAN 2021, the G7 Summit, and even NATO Summit and Japan-EU Summit, and more. So I think all the conversations surrounding these issues point to one major actor as a major source of the destabilization. And all of you know who that is. So even though facing China's military threat has become Taiwanese people a daily routine, and Taiwan will not bend to the pressure, and nor will it be the provocateur. We will continue to enhance our self-defense and asymmetrical warfare capability to be better prepared for both present and future challenges. So under President Tsai's leadership and under her policy of prudence, she has prevented cross-strait conflicts over the years, so which is also recognized by like-minded countries and leaders. So as we embark on the endeavor to protect our common interest and defend our shared values, Taiwan actually is situated in a very critical position. So I believe that the world cannot safeguard freedom and democracy without Taiwan. And Taiwan is prepared to work with the regional actors to ensure peace, stability, and prosperous development. So I'm very, very happy and looking forward to the forthright idea and observation by Bill and Teresa and many, many others experts during this virtual conference. So I'm looking forward to the success of the event. Thank you.
Daniel, thank you so much. It's great to have you joining us today, and as you are, we're also looking forward to a robust discussion. I'm going to cede the floor now to my colleague Rachel Bernstein. Rachel's part of our political and security affairs team based in NBR's Washington, D.C. office, and she will be moderating our session this afternoon and introducing our speakers. So Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and thank you, Dr. General Chen, both for your framing remarks. I think they've set our panel up really well, and it will certainly be an interesting discussion today. As Michael mentioned, my name is Rachel Bernstein, and I am a project manager at NBR, and it's really my true pleasure to be moderating this panel today. We're joined by two excellent panelists. As Dr. General Chen and Michael have mentioned, they'll be discussing the outcomes of the recent sixth plenum and the outlook on the future stability of the CCP, and what this means for Taiwan, and also in turn for US policy towards the Indo-Pacific. Before I introduce the panelists, just a quick reminder that if you do have a question during the event, we ask that you please submit the questions to events@nbr.org via email, and then we will be able to see it there. So I'll now turn to introduce our panelists, and I'll introduce them in the order they will be speaking. So Mr. McCahill, starting with you. William McCahill joined NBR as a senior resident fellow in 2016, and his work focuses on Chinese politics and policy. Before joining MBR, Mr. McCahill had worked in Hong Kong and China as a senior advisor for the China at Mirabad Group, a Swiss private bank headquartered in Geneva, and earlier in a similar capacity for Religare Capital Markets. He had also previously founded and managed a China-focused equities and macro research firm, opened the Beijing office of a major American law firm, and operated a business consultancy in China. A 25-year Foreign Service career preceded Mr. McCahill's business activities. He began his diplomatic service in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Beijing, subsequently held senior posts at U.S. missions in Western Europe, Scandinavia, and Canada, and in 2000 retired from his last posting as charge d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. His academic background includes degrees from Boston College and Harvard University in theology, English, the history of religion, and Sanskrit and Indian studies. We are very excited to have him join us today and very much looking forward to his remarks. Our second panelist, Teresa Lowe, is the professional staff member for the U.S. House of Representatives Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation, where she serves as a policy resource to Democratic members on matters related to the Indo-Pacific. Prior to joining the committee, Teresa was a research associate at the Council on Foreign Relations for the International Institutions and Global Governance Program. She also has prior experience at the U.S. Department of State, Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and the U.S. Department of Defense Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Teresa received her MA in Security Studies and BS in Foreign Service from Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. Thank you both for joining us today. And with those introductions done, I'll now turn it over to Mr. McCahill for his remarks. Thank you.
Bill, I think you're muted. I just sent you a request to unmute. There you go.
Okay. Well, thank you all for the introduction, and it's great pleasure to be here. I'm sitting in the office of the late Senator Slade Gorton, whose Supreme Court certificate is behind me. So I've never been elected to anything except my high school class presidency, so this is quite a promotion on the spot here. But as Michael and Director General Chen were just mentioning, the 19th Central Committee has held its sixth plenum in early November and issued this historical resolution. The plenum meeting and the resolution, in effect, raises the curtain on a year that will be full of intense and intensive politicking across the Chinese Communist Party, right up through the 20th Party Congress, probably in November or so of next year. This is a period that anthropologists might call a liminal period, a time of transition between two phases when there's uncertainty and sometimes danger can prevail, when everything, not everything, but much is in flux. And so we see in primitive societies that anthropologists observed, or in organized religions, they tend to mark these liminal transitions with rituals like bar, bas mitzvah, or confirmation to mark the passage from childhood to adolescence and to further maturity. And the rituals are intended not only to solemnize the passage from one stage to another, but somehow spiritually to protect the person from possible harm as he or she crosses the boundary. But you don't want to make too much of that analogy, but it does suggest some of the tensions that are inherent in any kind of transition, be that personal or political, as the one we are now watching the Chinese Communist Party undergo. Well, by pushing first the Politburo and then the entire Central Committee plenum to approve this historical resolution, as it's called, opening his new era, Xi Jinping has himself emphasized the importance of the transition that he is attempting to lead. From the era of reform and opening that was launched by Deng Xiaoping in 1978 and then confirmed by his own six plenums, a historical resolution in 1981, that aimed to close the Mao Zedong period of one-man rule and continuous revolution that Mao had in effect marked with a historical resolution in 1945. So from the era that brought China unimagined material wealth, and global prominence to an uncertain new realm of what Xi Jinping calls common prosperity. From an era of mostly orderly party transitions from one leader to another, to a phase where one man rules without term limits, and thus far without any succession plan that's in place. Now, older Chinese, people my age, for example, with memories of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, as well as some younger people who know their country's real history, they understandably see in Xi Jinping's new era an awful lot that looks like Mao Zedong's old era. But Xi's historical resolution is less about fact-based history than it is about his own future. It is both a self-bestowed mandate to rule and a manifesto for what he intends to achieve in his reign. And he's placed already national security as the top priority of that new era. About 1/3 of the document spins his predecessors into a version of history that's been freshly revised for the centennial year of the party this year. The remaining 2/3 or so expound in absolutely ponderous propaganda language the attributes of Xi Jinping thought, which will guide and grace the new era. Having plowed through a lot of that, I was reminded of the famous simile of Pierre Reichmans, the great sinologist, who once said, reading Chinese Communist Party documents is like having to eat sausages made of sawdust. A theme that is throughout this historical resolution is of historical inevitability, what theologians would call teleology. That history has brought the Chinese Communist Party to this glorious moment and to this man who will lead them on to the next century of greatness. And whatever its literary merits, this historical resolution, as well as the so-called spirit of the Sixth Plenum that passed it, are now being proselytized throughout the party ranks and will be so for many, many more months, even though all of the main themes had been present in the propaganda machinery for months before the actual plenum. You can almost hear the chords of the Messiah playing in the background, if only the Chinese Communist Party didn't claim to be atheists. Anyway, this year ahead will have its challenges for Xi, even though he thinks he can surmount these. But a superstitious Chinese might say, Lao Tian Hui You Ta De An Pai. So there are benchmark dates, threshold events that will include the February Beijing Winter Olympics, the NPC, National People's Congress, and the People's Consultative Conference in March, those plenary sessions, probably in March if the COVID is relatively under control. There'll be the summer conclave of party leaders and their elders at Beidaihe, up on the coast above Beijing. Next fall, after that, a 7th plenum meeting to prepare for the actual 20th Party Congress itself. Now, Xi Jinping and his courtiers, like the wily Wang Huning, hope to engineer these events so that the 20th Congress turns into Xi's triumphant coronation for a 3rd term as General Secretary, or possibly even as being crowned as the chairman of the party, like his idol Mao Zedong. Nothing can be allowed to go wrong, they say to themselves. And throughout this entire period, party cadre at all levels will be jockeying for promotion, politicking, trying to pick the right senior coattails to ride up their career ladder, and taking as few decisions as they possibly can, lest they make the wrong decision. Now, Xi Jinping himself has no obvious rival. The Director General mentioned the purge that came at the very outset of his reign. No obvious rival, no obvious successor. And yet within the party ranks and among politically astute Chinese citizens, there is a fair amount of disappointment and discontent with Xi. You might see these as clusters of critics. Clusters of critics who keep quiet lest they be silenced, as has happened to many of them already, and unable to or blocked from organizing. The discontent, I think, is hard to quantify, let alone to judge its political strength. but it is possible to identify at least a half dozen or so of these clusters of critics. There is a first group that is Xi Jinping's fellow so-called princelings, who seem to feel that Xi has risen well beyond his natural abilities. There are academics and intellectuals, although not necessarily with great political influence. Thirdly, you have a group of economic technocrats, the residual fans of former Premier Zhu Rongji. Fourth, and maybe one of the more worrisome groups to Xi, is former General Secretary Jiang Zemin, Jiang's loyalists, and the Yangtze Delta business people who have been connected with them. Fifthly, you have prominent business people other than that Yangtze Delta crowd, like some of the real estate tycoons, for example. You also have in a sixth group victims, tens of thousands of victims of Xi's anti-corruption campaigns. These are people with scores to settle. And last, and maybe most worrisome of all, you have senior figures in the security, both the public security and the state security apparatus, where a deep purge is underway and will continue through the end of the year, most likely. Meanwhile, of course, while Xi and company obsess over their party politics, the real world continues to turn, largely beyond Xi's ability to control, as the coronavirus's latest twist makes all too clear. China's domestic economy, which is ostensibly within Xi's remit as chairman of everything, will continue to confound policymakers. There are high public and private debt levels, well over 300% of GDP by any objective accounting, and these are likely to trigger corporate bankruptcies, and they will certainly further erode local government finances. And if property prices continue to fall as they have been in major cities for the past couple of months, China's highly leveraged so-called urban middle class will find that their main, if perhaps their only, assets are shrinking. And the wealth effect will then shift into reverse. And that will have consequences not only for consumption of consumer goods and services, for aggregate demand across the economy, consequences on public morale, and perhaps even on social order. And a property market slowdown would then ripple across the entire economy, as real estate development accounts for roughly a third of China's GDP. In the background, of course, there are longer trends that look set to continue and to continue to challenge Chinese policymakers. They're almost cliches, and we all know them. Declining productivity, shrinking workforce, an aging population. Financial Times reported earlier this week that adult diapers now outsell infant nappies in China, and chronic diseases that are weighing on public health. Lastly, we have the proverbial black swans. Feng Shui might be a black swan. And as if to get the superstitions tingling this October 1st, at the Tiananmen flag-raising ceremony that morning, in front of the hundreds, thousands of people who converge on that, a black swan literally walked across the square. How it got there is a bit of a mystery. The police were quick to capture it and shoo it away, but not before a lot of the onlookers had taken video. So the bottom line is that those of us who watch China and have to deal with it should really be prepared for an uncertain and possibly tumultuous year ahead, leading up until next fall's Party Congress. And what I am concerned about is that if come next spring, say, Xi Jinping, who is normally quite risk averse, if somehow he senses that his mandate is slipping and that he imagines ways to keep his grip on power and grant him that third general secretary term and hold the legacy that he sees himself created, would he be tempted, as this risk-averse man, might he be tempted to take risks? And as the Chinese folk saying goes, the cornered dog will jump the wall, Goji Jiaochang. And that, I think, leads us to Taiwan and Teresa.
Thank you very much, Mr. McHale. That was a really comprehensive overview, and I think will provide a strong foundation for our discussion later on. I'll now turn the floor over to Teresa, who will talk a bit more about the implications for Taiwan. Teresa, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you so much to NBR for having me. It's a true honor to be here with you and with Bill. Before I get started, I want to issue the usual disclaimers. I'm joining and speaking today strictly in my own personal capacity. These views are very much those of my own, and they should not be construed to be reflective of anyone else, certainly not my employer, certainly not the House Foreign Affairs Committee, et cetera, et cetera. And so with that out of the way, Bill, I think, very helpfully laid out a lot of these political developments, of which I very much agree with, particularly his analyses on some of the upcoming challenges and potential, hurdles and danger points in the coming years, particularly, Xi's consolidation of power has gone a certain way, but would a fairly risk-averse man take risks if pressed? And I think that has been a very important question, one that I think will continue merit attention in the coming months and certainly years. Stepping back a little bit and just to broaden the scope out, I do want to focus my remarks perhaps a little bit more on Taiwan and the implications of continued tensions across the straits. But I like to think of cross-strait relations and the dynamics between Taiwan and China. I don't think that they occur in a vacuum, right? And I think Bill outlined some of the political developments as well as the Winter Olympics that will happen in China next year. But I think that there are other political developments in the region that are relevant to this conversation in the coming 12 months. First and foremost is obviously Taiwan has a referendum as well as elections. And those are usually highly watched certainly by the United States, but no more closely, I guess, than the Chinese Communist Party itself. Of course, the United States has midterm elections, and politics discourse around election years in the House is always certainly something that can be unpredictable, but also a catalyst for developments. And also, there are major elections in South Korea and Japan, regional neighbors, one of which has become increasingly vocal about the challenges of cross-strait tensions and the instability that an aggressive PRC poses. I think Xi's intentions and the power consolidation that he's embarked on is certainly not new for those of us who have been paying attention. But even if there was any debate or question about his intentions or the Chinese Communist Party's direction, 3 to 5 years ago, I think there really isn't any question or debate about it now. I think it's gone fairly clearly. And I've come to realize that when you listen to the CCP, they're actually quite clear about what they want sometimes. And so I think it's certainly a cause for concern, especially when you look at some of the rhetoric that Xi has used himself in the past surrounding Taiwan. But I think that this increasing assertiveness, aggressiveness, even from China in its near abroad, its foreign policy, and certainly across the strait, has really helped further catalyze some of the conversations around the risks of the destabilizing China in the Indo-Pacific, and has prompted conversations and opportunities for further cooperation on issues certainly surrounding Taiwan, but also other areas of cooperation to help facilitate a secure, stable, prosperous Indo-Pacific. Right, we saw earlier reports today from former Prime Minister Abe about warning about the emergency situation a PRC invasion of Taiwan would create. We've seen some pretty strong comments from the Australian Defense Minister as well on the issue. And we've also seen European allies and partners become increasingly concerned and increasingly vocal about the cross-strait tensions, but also about China's behavior in general. I think these are not necessarily statements or rhetoric that or even some of them pushing out policies that one would have necessarily expected 3, 4, 5 years ago. And I think that there is a shift in how a lot of countries are thinking about it, even India, right, where having had skirmishes, long-time skirmishes with China on its border, the developments in the summer last year has certainly pushed the government of India into a slightly different direction than the one that they had embarked upon. You've seen them be a lot more open and receptive to engagements like the Quad, even for a non-alignment country. So I think that there's certainly a lot to discuss here. I'm very eager to get into questions and discussion. So thank you again. I'll close there, and thank you again for having me.
Thanks, Teresa. Those are really interesting remarks, and it's interesting to get the broader perspective, especially on how some countries are changing their stances, their opinions, even their policies towards cross-strait relations in Taiwan in the past few years. I will use my power as moderator to ask a couple questions before we open it up to the audience. But just as a reminder to our participants that if you do have a question, to please submit the questions via email at events@mbr.org. So events@mbr.org. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and ask the first question. So Teresa, you touched on the fact that Taiwan will hold elections next year, in addition to the fact that in China, there are several different events that might shape cross-strait policy. So I guess I would like to get both Bill and Teresa, your opinions on this. So what impact do you think Taiwan's elections might have on Beijing's strategy? And then kind of vice versa, what impact do you think the Party Congress and Beijing's increasing pressure on Taiwan, what impact will that have on Taiwan's elections? Anyone can go first, maybe Teresa with you.
Sure. I'm happy to jumpstart the conversation and turn it over to Bill to cover anything that I might have missed. So yeah, I think this is a very important question. I think if you look at how Taiwan elections have gone in even just recent years and how China has responded, I think it's very much the CCP, I think, has a proclivity and penchant for supporting KMT for some of the historical positions that KMT has espoused. Now, I think some of that is changing, particularly after the 2020 elections. I think you saw both parties sort of recalibrate a little bit about what their policy on cross-straits really is. So I think that is important to note. And there are people far smarter than me, steeped in the issues of Taiwan's domestic politics, who have written quite a bit about the nuances of the different political parties in Taiwan and how they view cross-strait relations. So I want to encourage people who are interested to take a look at that. But I do think that, on the one hand, we've seen in 2020, we saw in 2018, some Chinese influence ramp up very much prior to elections, and I think that we can expect that. And I think that one of the concerns that I have about these issues is much like the discourse in the United States surrounding issues of misinformation, disinformation, media propaganda, etc., that we've seen in recent years. Those conversations tend to have a polarizing political effect that is very unhelpful for advancing actual security and building up the infrastructure to make sure that our political discourse domestically is not being infiltrated by foreign influence. I think that is an issue that any democratic society faces, certainly the United States and certainly Taiwan, which is, like I said, on the front lines of a lot of these, the mainland's overtures, shall I say. And I think that will be continuously something to watch. I think that in the past, the PRC has responded very poorly when the DPP, which they view, in my opinion, incorrectly, as a pro-independence separatist political party, when they do well, that we tend to see a lot more aggressive response. But what I think is, and this is an unhelpful vicious cycle, which is we've also seen recently like young voters respond very particularly poorly to the PRC's increased pressure, right? So it's kind of this Gordian knot where the more the PRC sort of tries to flex its muscle, tries to impose economic costs, try to intimidate or bully Taiwan through military flights over the ADIZ, those are things that have not gone well with the younger population in Taiwan. And Xi Jinping, I think, knows this, which is part of the reason why I think there was a lot of concern from, perceived concern anyway, from Chinese leadership about like, if time is actually on their side. So I think it's an unhelpful situation where the more China tries to squeeze, the more the youth voters and the youth population in Taiwan tries to rebound, which only precipitates further, I think, aggression and frustration, concern from CCP. So I think that is a tension that we need to be very, very mindful of, and to sort of manage and watch closely as it moves forward.
I guess I'd pick up where Director General Chun left off, saying that perhaps the major destabilizing factor here is Xi Jinping himself. And I think a great deal of how cross-strait relations unfold in the next, 3 years leading up to the Taiwan presidential election has to do with how secure in his own skin, secure on his own throne, Xi Jinping himself is. It may well be, as the Director General said earlier, that in his third term, and if he prolongs that further, we'll see a sort of a consolidation of these more hawkish activities and the kind of rhetoric that has so turned off so many people in the democratic world, and certainly, as Teresa just said, among Taiwan younger people. I was struck in reading this historical resolution. There's certainly the canonical bit, if you will, about the Taiwan authorities who have stepped up their separatist activities aimed at Taiwan independence and all of that sort of stuff. But rather than closing that section of the resolution, rather than setting this almost the sort of deadlines that Xi has seemed to set in other public contexts, such as his July 1st 100th birthday party for the Communist Party, I found the language to be rather mild, although still full of this sense of this sort of almost historical determinism, the kind of arrogance that they have. In which, when it comes to, he says, realizing China's complete reunification, time and momentum are always on our side. That's a hard form of words, but it could have been much tougher, I thought. So I'm not sure whether Xi is leaving something open there, or quite what. I think if he said he's created expectations on Taiwan, he certainly, it comes out in the sort of jingoistic party media like the Global Times, that recovery of the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland is somehow imminent. And of course, this is then echoed by American military commanders and others. And if Xi, in a state of relative weakness, he seems to believe his own propaganda, but if he senses that he now has to sort of put his money where his mouth has been, then I think the risks go up. And so, again, as the Director General was saying earlier, a lot has to do with Xi himself and where he views his own political stability and place in the party.
Great, thank you both. You've both touched on this idea that Xi Jinping might go from being risk averse to being a bit more assertive. And Bill, in your initial remarks, you mentioned these seven critics. And I was wondering if you might be able to touch on which one you think makes Xi most insecure, and what factors, and both of you could really address this, what factors might change Xi's behavior from being more risk averse to being more aggressive.
Well, assuming that Xi gets through this next year and his coronation at the 20th Party Congress goes as he hopes, you know, perhaps he would be a more relaxed Winnie the Pooh than he has been before. He must be extremely tense, and certainly as we get into this this period leading up to the Congress, I mean, she knows very well where the sort of heretical voices are in the party, and he's one. I think he's like Wang Huning, who's a consummate conspiracy theorist. She is very much in the same mold, and you know, he's a man who's not very well educated, not very cosmopolitan by any stretch, but was sort of born and bred in this party propaganda and feuding and vendetta. I mean, look at the fate of his own father. And so if I were he sitting on his throne and looking at these various interest groups that could give him trouble, I think the one in the security apparatus, which, as I said earlier, is still being purged of people who are disloyal to him. And remember, you look at this historical resolution and the other documents that have come out of the Plenum, and there's a lot about loyalty to the party center with Xi Jinping as its core. So personal loyalty to Xi. The whole anti-corruption campaign which has now become permanent, a fixture right in the bureaucracy, has shifted from sort of plain vanilla corruption, the usual kickbacks and extortion and that sort of stuff, to a kind of search for heretics and those who are disloyal to Xi. So I think that apparatus, we've seen a former justice minister detained recently. We've seen a former vice minister of public security being detained. We've seen old Comrade Meng, the former head of Interpol, getting off his airplane in Beijing and not being able to go home again. There's a lot going on in that slice of the bureaucracy. And of course, there's still people there who owe their jobs to Zhou Yongkang, who's now enjoying his reading list in the Xinjiang prison or wherever he happens to be. The second group, I think, that is worrisome to see is the group that I've vaguely called sort of Jiang Zemin Yangtze Delta business crowd. And that includes people like Jack Ma and Cheng Wei, the founder of Didi Chuxing, and the sort of Hangzhou, Shanghai entrepreneurial class. And as we've learned, many of the beneficial owners of their companies, like Alibaba and Ant Financial, Didi itself, are in fact connected with Jiang and his son and his grandson. And so that's a kind of 2-for-1 there for Xi Jinping. You've got people who've become quite influential in the society with an overt political connection to a former party leader, a hell of a lot of money, access to all sorts of personal data. And that, to my mind, if I'm as slightly paranoid as Xi Jinping is, that looks like a worrisome crowd who will have to be gelded some way or other.
Yeah, and I think on the Taiwan front, I don't think this is particularly new insight, but just a couple of thoughts anyway. I personally believe that the Chinese Communist Party would still prefer a peaceful reunification with Taiwan. It is not in their party interest to go out and fight a conflict that would be Pyrrhic and costly in the best of cases. And I also believe that the Communist Party knows that a invasion or reunification effort with Taiwan needs to be a no-lose proposition. That, you know, if an invasion, for example, were to fail, that is a catastrophe that the party would have a very difficult time recovering from. And so therefore, you know, it's not something that they would like to do prematurely or unless they feel like they have no alternative and time is not on their side. So and I don't think this is a good answer, but I think to your direct question of what might make Xi more risk prone in this space, and to sort of pull the ultimate trigger, I think it's if there are actions, policies that that he deems to have been over this red line, or that he feels like he must act now to either save face, preserve party leadership, credibility, or to send a strong message because he feels like that deterrence has deterrence from quote unquote the separatism, the splitism has failed. So the tension here is like, I do not believe that that analysis necessarily means that what Taiwan does in order to build up its self-defense, what the United States, you know, does with Taiwan in terms of its partnership and arms sales and everything should stop, even though those are things that consistently, you know, and consistently irritate Beijing. But there is some sort of line, I think, where if crossed, that would probably precipitate some sort of action from the Chinese Communist Party, even when they feel like they have no option. And the problem really just is it's not clear what those lines are short of, say, an independent declaration from Taiwan tomorrow.
I'm really no expert on Taiwan in the way that Teresa is, but I have wondered, given these sorties of aircraft into the Taiwan ADIZ and what we saw back in 1995 when Li Donghui came to the States and visited Cornell and so on, the kind of what the military men would call bracketing shots of missiles around Taiwan. We see the sort of activity in the South China Sea, putting aircraft and vessels through the Bosher Channel south of Taiwan and between Taiwan and the Philippines. Whether in a kind of strutting his stuff, showing his feathers sort of move, Xi would not be tempted to do something like lob a few hot apples at Pratas, something far short of an actual invasion of Taiwan proper, but you know, a sort of a kind of escalate the intimidation sort of move. Anyway, I just said defer to people who understand the military situation far better than I do. But there is that, and one group that we haven't really talked about are the PLA themselves, where Xi, you know, he's the party's army, he's the commander in chief, and it was the very first entity that he purged, and purged quite severely. Some 50 general officers lost their heads in all of that. Even in this historical resolution, the resolution speaks about the military having been in a poor state before the Messiah Xi Jinping arrived to turn it around. Whether there are not commanders there who would take risks or respond to provocation, that's why I said this whole year ahead is full of all sorts of uncertainties, really, that we're like the famous Indian proverb of the 6 blind men who touched the elephant, and each one just gets a little piece of it. And of course, for those of us in the English-speaking world, we've been deprived of reporting from some of the very best journalists who had been covering China. Some are now covering China from Taiwan, from Taipei, which is great because there's much more media coverage of Taiwan in the US and British press than there's ever been. But still, Chris Buckley from the New York Times is sitting in Sydney, I think, and I don't know where Josh Chin from the Wall Street Journal went. And so it's just not quite we don't have quite the level of media coverage and insight that would give to us. So we're a bit handicapped in that sense.
Sorry, Rachel, if I may, just Bill's excellent remarks prompted one additional thought from me to close out perhaps this question, which is I think it's all the more important because of what we've discussed so far for us all collectively concerned parties, countries, stakeholders to help Taiwan enhance its deterrence. I think the goal should be and has been, I think, to enhance Taiwan's strategic capabilities and deterrence to make it prickly so that the PRC has to think twice before launching across the strait. And that comes in many forms, right? We often talk about the military and security components of that deterrence, but there are also other pillars, right? Like the economic costs that would ensue, that should ensue if the PRC decides to launch an invasion. What would the diplomatic costs look like, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is an issue set that is thorny enough as is, and it behooves all of us to think about the various different toolkits at our disposal and weave together as much of a collective sort of weave our toolkits together to help Taiwan enhance its defensive capabilities in both the military and security realm and beyond.
Thank you both for those remarks. And Teresa, I think your last comment actually really dovetails nicely with one of the questions that we received from the audience, talking about expanding this toolkit a bit. This question is about more Taiwan's or the US allies and partners and what we can do regarding Taiwan. So let's go ahead and read it out. But in Europe, we have seen a major shift in views regarding China and Taiwan. China is viewed much more critically due to Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, and threats against Taiwan, whereas Taiwan is viewed much more positively, for example, Lithuania, and countries see opportunities to enhance relations with Taiwan. How can the US coordinate and cooperate with Europe to push back against China and improve relations with Taiwan and support Taiwan's international space?
Yeah, that's such an important question. So I think that there are a couple of things just off the top of my head. The first and foremost is this really important platform, the GCTF, which is an opportunity, an international platform for Taiwan to really showcase its strengths and the beneficial role and contributions it can make to the international community on things ranging from health, economic empowerment, women empowerment, cybersecurity, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that this is a platform that has definitely taken off. More countries are interested in it, more countries are participating in it. There's now increasing footprint in the Pacific Islands as well as in the Western Hemisphere. So I think that, the continuous elevation of such a platform in cooperation with Taiwan, it's still informal. It doesn't trigger the one China policies of each individual countries, even though China is going to say otherwise. I think it is a very important way to, again, allow Taiwan to shine and contribute meaningfully, and also for countries to have a chance to really be exposed and to the people of Taiwan and the benefits that they can provide. But also, I think in the diplomatic space, and this is something that I want to sort of highlight, which is Representative Bera's bill, the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act, to go off of what I said in terms of looking at not just military and security toolkits, but also look at, say, for example, diplomatic ones. There are issues of Taiwan's access to UN organizations and special bodies, right? The World Health Organization certainly immediately comes to mind, particularly in light of the COVID situation. Now, this is a real shame, right? For many reasons. The first and foremost being this is not the global pandemic challenge respects no boundaries and no borders. And Taiwan has advanced medical equipment, advanced medical expertise, personnel, and experience to share. And yet it's not really been allowed to do that. And it also doesn't quite get the information from the WHO in a timely enough fashion for them to be able to sort of contribute and feed back to the ecosystem. So, and then the list goes on, right? There's also the International Civil Aviation Organization and other organizations where statehood is not a prerequisite for participation and membership, right? Or even observer status. And I think the politicization of Taiwan's participation in these global fora, like the World Health Organization, like ICAO, on these transnational issues, is problematic. And I know that there are certainly countries in Europe and and Taiwan's diplomatic allies have been on side and being very vocal in this message. But I think at the end of the day, it is a numbers game at the United Nations. And I think that the more this issue gets elevated and the more that people can pay attention to these issues in all corners, the more likely that we can also bring in non-traditional allies and partners to help advocate for Taiwan's meaningful participation, if nothing for the fact that they are a powerful sort of amplifier and a force for good, and can meaningfully contribute. So I'll pause there. I'm sure there are other examples for where we can work together, but I'll pause there and see if Bill has anything that I haven't thought of.
Well, it's sort of naive and cliched, but I think let Taiwan be Taiwan. And I said one of the great benefits of having so many of these China-skilled correspondents now resident in Taipei is that they're there to tell the story, and it's a great story. I mean, just look at the sort of coverage, media coverage that came out of Taiwan's handling of the pandemic, and compare that to what happened on the China mainland. I mean, where you now have a citizen journalist who is apparently starving herself to death in a jail cell. But Taiwan's own outreach, the foreign minister recently traveled across Europe, more time in Eastern Europe than Western Europe, but a real moment of opportunity there. I mean, you have a new German government with the Greens, Annalena Baerbock about to take, you think, the foreign ministry. And there's a level of frustration and annoyance with China that's an opportunity for Taiwan to move there. Just yesterday in London, Xi, the head of MI6, the secret MI6 Secret Intelligence Service, gave a long speech about the China threat that the UK intelligence services sense. So we're a long way from the sort of golden era of the Panda Boys, David Cameron and George Osborne, and all of these represent opportunities for Taiwan. As Confucius Institutes close, Taiwan language learning programs are there. I mean, as someone who's lived for a long, long time on the China mainland and traveled extensively in Taiwan, albeit as a tourist or a business person, it's another world, and that's a wonderful story to tell. And I think there are so many doors that are ajar that just need to be pushed a little bit with cultural outreach and people-to-people political exchanges. I mean, you've got European parliamentarians now calling on the president in Taipei. This would have been unheard of 2 years ago. And these are representatives of nations that do have seats in the United Nations and on the Security Council, where they can make a difference. So I think it's, to say, naive and cliched to say let Taiwan be Taiwan, but that's it's a story that sells itself.
Thank you both. I think we'll continue on this thread for just one more question before switching gears, but we do have one that's related. So the Biden administration is holding the first summit for democracy next week. Beijing strongly opposes Taiwan's participation in this first ever democracy summit by the White House. What is the significance of Taiwan being invited to this summit hosted by President Biden? And what does this mean for the CCP's continued emphasis on its governing style, which it says is better and more efficient than the Western democracy?
Well, Teresa lives in Washington on Capitol Hill, so she has to answer this.
I was gonna try to see if Bill, you want to take it first. I mean, I think, look, I think China is going to oppose anything, right? We've seen that from the smallest things. It doesn't really matter. They're going to demarche. They're going to make the calls for any variety of things that they will deem to be as an increasing of U.S.-Taiwan official relations. But I think the President's Summit for Democracy, Taiwan is a vibrant, well-established, progressive democracy with experiences to share and lessons to contribute. And I think the intent of the summit itself is very much to sort of strengthen, given the sort of onslaught from authoritarianism in the recent years, there's something to be said about renewing our commitment to democracy and working together to build up our democratic institutions. And again, which better partner than Taiwan, which is on the front lines facing this current undermining attempt from the Communist Party. So, I mean, I think it doesn't surprise me that the Biden administration chose to include Taiwan. I think that it would be their participation is certainly an additive to it. And I think that, again, Beijing will demarche as it will, but that shouldn't stop, as Bill said, Taiwan from being Taiwan and letting its merits shine through and be recognized in its own right.
Hear, hear.
Great. All right, Bill, if nothing to add, we can move on to another question. All right. So our next question is, do either panelists have any observations about the danger of this period of the PRC's increased isolation, both self-imposed and externally imposed, and kind of the decrease of Xi's global profile as another potential trigger to ill-advised adventurism?
Bill, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I'm not sure to what extent she appreciates, for example, the costs of wolf warrior diplomacy have been. If you look at, for example, the Pew Foundation's polling of foreign attitudes towards China, they're on the way towards something like pariah statehood status. And you take things like this series now, the 3 new so-called data security and data protection laws, one of which has had the effect of the Chinese shutting down their AIS, the ship positioning systems that shippers and logistics people all rely on. All of the ground-based stations in China, none of them has been signaling for the last 10 days or so. This amidst the kind of global supply chain crisis that requires absolute cooperation and in China's best interest. They're a major exporter. How does this stuff get from Yiwu in Zhejiang province to Walmart in Silverdale, Washington? People need to know that. And so we're a long way from them being the sort of, what was Bob Zellick's phrase, the responsible stakeholder. Quite the opposite. And so this whole, the pandemic as it's unfolded and the secrecy that the Chinese have clamped down around its origins and the sort of draconian lockdowns that they've imposed on their own people at considerable economic cost, that against the background of this kind of goulash of gibberish that you get from their propaganda mouthpieces, really has set them. They're kind of in a world of their own. I mean, sure, they can say democratic revolution all they want in these documents, but it's Orwellian. The definitions have nothing to do with what we and Taiwan would call democracy. But I mean, I know people who used to advise Chinese leaders about how to deal with barbarians like the Americans, and they're very, very unhappy with how this is all unfolded. But they're outside the circle. And I mean, people like Yang Jiechi know better. And Cui Tiankai, who was in Washington for all of those years. These are people who've been educated abroad, who speak perfect English, who are very sophisticated characters, and yet to have a meeting with one of them is to hear you might as well have somebody read the People's Daily to you. And so I think it's a terrible disjuncture. There's simply no way to have a genuine conversation with this regime, frankly. Anyway, I think they have in effect isolated them, but right. Honestly, I think Xi feels himself riding high, and this whole comment, and what do they say there? 我们的那个制度的优越性, the superiority of our system. I think a man like Xi of limited abilities, but quite susceptible to a coterie of advisors who know a lot more than he does. It's quite a dangerous predicament, really. Teresa, you have.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is to your point about their sense of superiority and Xi riding high. I came across an op-ed in the National Interest from the Chinese ambassador and the Russian ambassador, following up on the previous question, I guess, of Summit for Democracy. And they basically, well, one, criticized the Summit for Democracy, two, criticized Taiwan's participation, and three, basically talked about how the United States the Summit for Democracy is in and of itself undemocratic, and why, you know, the Russian and Chinese models, you know, work, and it's an interesting read. But I think to Bill's point about, you know, China's self-imposed isolationism and how she's keeping a very, very tight circle. This is something that we hear a lot too, where even significantly different from his predecessors, he's kept a much tighter inner circle than most. So it's really hard to get at what he's thinking, even really know who, you know, who has his ear. But I think on the other hand, so I don't know if she cares or is aware of how unpopular China's international standing is. Apparently in South Korea, China polls lower than Japan, which is kind of mind-boggling in its own right. But I think the one thing that I've observed is something that the Chinese think they have in their back pocket is really the sort of economic clout that they hold, right? Like they probably think that to a certain extent, whether you like us or not, whether you think that the democratic system works or not, or if our system is better, at the end of the day, I think the Chinese market is something that's still quite compelling. And you know, this has sparked a whole lot of other challenges related to economic coercion, reliance of supply chains, et cetera, that have become exposed, the vulnerabilities of which have been exposed during the pandemic. But I think to a certain extent that I don't want to presume to know what General Secretary Xi is thinking, but I wouldn't be surprised if that is at least a factor that he thinks he can sort of bank on, at least for the time being, as he continues to sort of win other countries over one way or another through development and largesse, et cetera, et cetera.
Money.
Great, thank you both. So you both kind of talked about foreign diplomacy and kind of internal op-eds, and so we do have a question that's related to that with the United Front. And what do you think the role of the United Front is in cross-strait relations, as well as the CCP's domestic stability now? Bill, maybe you would like to take this first. I can expand a bit on the
I watched
question.
Teresa looking at the sky and thought she was about to answer it.
Oh, please, this one requires a little bit of thought. So please, I'm very happy to hear your thoughts.
There is no question that with he's been now General Secretary for 9 years, has put tremendous resources into Xuan and into overseas propaganda and into the United Front. I mean, here I'm sitting and looking across the road here at the University of Washington campus, where the United Front has been very active with Chinese and Chinese speaking students. So there's basically an open checkbook for these activities, and they can be extremely effective, especially operating in the Chinese diaspora in the U.S. So I don't know how to judge their effectiveness in Taiwan. I think Taiwan's own openness, transparency, and the health and vitality of civil society is itself a kind of almost like an inoculation against some of these United Front tactics. But with absolutely bottomless pits of money to throw around, all sorts of people can be, as the Chinese idiom has it, gao dingla. And nowhere easier than when they can operate in their own language. And so efforts in Southeast Asia have been quite impressive in fact. So as for the United Front's work in China itself, I think that's more sort of an historical artifact at this point. But the integration of United Front work with the party state media, and you remember Xi has many times called it says the Dang Mei Xing Da. The media are part of the party family, whether it's so-called CGTV in London or New York or correspondence in Washington. And there's a kind of continuity of message and of financial energy, for want of a better word. And I'm sure that the resources that they put into figuring out Taiwan and finagling Taiwan are considerable. Teresa could pick up there.
No, I think Bill's right. I also hesitate to judge the efficacy, but I will say, and to go back to something I think I said towards the beginning of our session here together, the one thing that I am concerned about is the sort of continued politicization of some of these security issues. This is obviously related to like the cybersecurity components that I've talked about, but also in just sort of general discourse. To be a little bit more specific, like the Thai government had taken certain steps to curb or to close down or to restrict certain media because their reports were based on reports and investigations that they were basically controlled by, like CCP forces, or that the heads of it were GCP friendly, that had been bought out, et cetera, et cetera. Now, again, like as someone who did not look too closely at it, all I can say is, true or not, the perception then became for the opposition party that the Thai government is, censoring or cracking down on free speech, et cetera, that, just because, Zhongtian or whatever is publishing news that is critical of the government, that they therefore are censoring it. So I think when you put the United Front Work Department into these conversations, when, like Bill said, there is a lot of money floating around. There's a lot of, business between Taiwan and China. Like some of that money just sort of, you don't necessarily know where it goes and you don't know how to trace it. And I think it has it plays a complicating role for democracies like Taiwan, like the United States, where the opposition and the ruling party fundamentally don't see eye to eye on a number of issues. One party can then take advantage of some of the situations and claim that the opposition, the sitting party, for example, is, being oppressive or is not being respectful of rights, et cetera, et cetera. And that discourse makes it very, very hard as a country or, for the people together to sort of address the problem, be on the same page for those challenges. And I think that is a real worry. Again, like I said, this is not unique to Taiwan, but it's just particularly urgent because they're on the front lines so frequently.
You want to see Exhibit A and perhaps even a laboratory that they've set up for themselves for dealing with Taiwan. Take a look at Hong Kong.
All right, I know we are at time, almost exactly, but I am going to push through one more question that came in from Shirley Khan. So maybe try and keep answers to 1 minute or less. But her question is, how should President Biden clarify our policy under the Taiwan Relations Act to deter China from attacking Taiwan? And complicated questions, but maybe short lightning round answers.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I understood. How should President Biden clarify our policy?
Yes, so the full question is, Teresa, you articulated the increased concerns in US, Japan, Australia, India, and other countries about an aggressive Xi Jinping, not a risk-adverse Xi. How should President Biden clarify our policy under the TRA to deter China from attacking Taiwan?
I see. So I think the Taiwan Relations Act, the 6 assurances, and the 3 communiques sort of stand on for themselves, and the supporting documents and the statements that have been made surrounding this issue stand on their own. I think that the US policy on Taiwan has not changed, and that it's the Chinese Communist Party, it's Xi Jinping that's moving the dial. And so I think that what the administration has done thus far in terms of clarifying the ironclad support for Taiwan per those legal documents, as well as the informal documents through the joint communiques and the 6 assurances, as well as the body of remarks from US officials, present and past. I think that does speak volumes, and it's pretty clear what the US policy for Taiwan is. And I don't know that needs to be changed. And I think that countries, even without the United States saying any more or any less, I think they can make up their own mind about the challenges of instability across the straits and how respective capitals want to respond. But over to Bill.
Well, I think President Biden and I are almost the same age. I won't say who is older. And he's a very old-fashioned kind of tactile politician. And he's mostly Irish in his ethnicity. And so he lets himself go. And I think that what have been described in the media as sort of policy slips and then have been walked back and corrected really do reflect his view on Taiwan and a kind of affection that's there. I was struck right from the outset on January 20th when Xiaobi Kim was invited to the inauguration. It's an action that spoke a lot louder than words. And so, yes, we've got the TRA and the 6 assurances and this whole now 40 years almost of a sort of precedent. But in the kind of openness that the president himself has shown and the level of sort of protocol attention that Taiwan representatives are now getting in Washington is, I think, very much a reflection of the president's own quite generous instincts about this.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for joining us. And thank you to all of our participants who joined us today and for all of your great questions. Teresa and Bill, it was really great hearing your remarks and I really appreciate you both sharing your insight with us. Director General Chen, thank you for joining us as well. And before we sign off, I just want to give a shout out to the MBR staff who helped organize this event, particularly Audrey Mossberger for her excellent organization, and Michael Wills for joining us for opening remarks, as well to Elliot Roberts who helped plan this event. And so with that, hope you all have a good evening or late afternoon on the West Coast. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.